Hello, everyone. Before we begin, it is important to reflect and acknowledge that the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, granted to the Haudenosaunee of 6 nations by the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. The land inside and surrounding the Haldimand Tract, including our Stratford campus, is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. I also acknowledge and recognize this area is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The forum has generated a lot of interest and, more importantly, a lot of participation. So I thank you for being here. I want you to know that I have enjoyed tremendously getting to know our campus, our people, and our broader community over the past 7 months. I know our community is experiencing a lot of frustration, and in some cases, fear about the current situation we are facing. I hear it and read your comments and questions for leadership. Although I regret I haven't been able to see you or hear your concerns directly in person. I know that we need to do better. I need to do better connecting with you in both formal and informal ways. And so as we move forward, and I strongly believe beyond the sustained period of reacting to the pandemic's twists and turns, as well as this period of fear and anxiety, I'm fully committed to strengthening the engagement of myself and the university's leadership with all of our communities, students, faculty, and staff. I'm hopeful that the forum today will help address some of your questions and concerns and shed more light on our plans to work with you as we return to opportunities to engage together in person and on our campuses. I'm joined today by Vice President and Academic and Provost, Jim Rush. Jim and I will provide an update on the COVID-19 situation and university operations. After our update, we will have a question and answer period moderated by Sandra Banks, Vice President, University Relations. Several other senior leaders have also tuned in and may help answer some of your questions. If you'd like to submit a question, you can do so using the Q&A feature on the right hand of your screen, which will open after the presentation. I'd also like to note that you can turn on closed captioning of the live stream in Microsoft Teams. So we'll turn to my presentation, we'll get the slides up, and I will be walking through the epidemiology of COVID-19 and the situation that we're now in, and then talk a little bit about the responses on the employee survey that we recently took, as well as our plans for the return to campus. And then Jim will conclude with some remarks on our planning towards the future of work at the University of Waterloo. So we go to the next slide. We've seen in recent weeks at all levels, Chief Public Health Officer for Canada, Dr. Theresa Tam, the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Ontario, Dr. Karen Moore, as well as Waterloo Region's Medical Officer for Health, Dr. Suli Wang, that they see that we are past the peak of the Omicron wave, and this is based on a number of indicators which I'll walk through. And Ontario has started to implement its reopening plan as of this Monday, with a gradual easing of restrictions continuing through the month of March if the current conditions continue to progress. We go to the next slide. One of the most significant indicators we now have on the spread of COVID-19 is based on wastewater signals, because as I'm sure everyone is aware, limitations in testing capacity have limited the ability to track new cases using PCR tests. It's important to note that this work has been based on the work of many investigators across the province, but our very own Professor Mark Servos has been a leader in the development of these methodologies. And what we can see in this slide, which is drawn from the Ontario Science Table, is that since the beginning of January, we've had a pretty significant decline in the wastewater signal, with the peak in the wastewater signal being very early in January, which is an early indicator, likely the first 10 days or so of January, the Omicron wave peaked in Ontario. We have similar signals for the region. We go to the next slide. We see the pattern for new admissions to ICU, and we can see that the curve is also starting to bend down. I want to draw a very important distinction between admissions to ICU or to hospitals and occupancy. What we see reported on a regular basis, and is a very important indicator in terms of the demands of our health system, is occupancy. It's how many people are in the hospital, either in wards or in ICUs on a given day. What this slide is showing is the admissions, which are tracking the level of new activity occurring in the community. And we see a very positive trend again in terms of new admissions coming down into the ICU. The reason this is important is this leads to, I think, one of the areas that I think has been a point of perceived inconsistency, is that there are continuing to be pressures on the healthcare system because the occupancy is a function of new admissions, length of stay, and discharges. And so as we had the peak, we had more people in the hospitals, and we've also have a challenge with discharging people because they don't necessarily, if they need to go to another level of care, those places are backed up as well. And so that's why our healthcare system continues to have pressures, even as we see the rates coming down in the community. And that's why we need to be cautious in our reopening plans, and the province is doing it in a staged way, and we're continuing to maintain many significant precautions to continue to keep the pressure on the healthcare system low. But the community signals that we're seeing from these two metrics, as well as many other metrics, show that we are at a stage that it is safe to start to slowly and gradually reopen things. We go to the next slide, which is also drawn from the science table. This shows the benefit of vaccination, particularly against severe disease. So the three panels are COVID cases, hospitalizations, and admissions to ICU. And you'll see in the orange line the numbers or the rates amongst the people who are unvaccinated, and the blue line amongst the people that are vaccinated. So very high degree of protection against admission to hospital and certainly against admission into ICU. On the left-hand panel, we see the peak in cases for both groups of people. And we know that, as I mentioned, with testing capacity being restricted, the peak was likely higher than what was observed once the testing capacity was restricted in late December. But what we see in this curve as well is the ongoing downwards trend in both groups, because even with the changed testing patterns, we now see a consistent downward trend. And the other thing I really want to emphasize here is that this sort of graphic and others like it have been used to suggest that vaccination doesn't work against Omicron. It does work against severe disease, and this data is looking at 2 doses. And it also does work against infection, but just not as well. And the protection against infection or getting the disease is about 30% with 2 doses and likely about 50% with the booster dose. So it is a reduced level of protection against infection, but it's still there, and it's still a very strong level of protection against hospitalization or severe disease. And with a booster dose is a very high degree of protection. If we turn to the next slide, what we have here from Public Health Ontario is data on cases by age and vaccination status in the previous 30 days. And so this relates largely to Omicron, but there will have been some Delta still mixed in that 30-day period. And the key message here is in adults that are fully vaccinated, certainly with 2 doses, and even better with the booster dose, the risk of hospitalization on a population basis, on a rate basis, is negligible. And the majority of our cases that we're seeing, as we hear about, are in unvaccinated individuals, and particularly in unvaccinated individuals that are older. We're also seeing cases that can be seen in those smaller blue bars on the right of cases in older individuals who have had either the 2 doses, what's listed here as post-series, or a booster dose. And this is why the province has launched a 4th dose campaign for certain individuals who are at the greatest risk in those older age groups. If you go to the next slide, we see the same pattern for deaths from COVID-19. And here you'll see that in the adult population that's vaccinated, there's virtually no deaths being illustrated. And I don't want this to be heard as discounting the significance of what's happening for our older adults. It is truly a tragedy that 2 years into this pandemic, something that we've known about the start, from within the earliest weeks, we knew that these were amongst the most vulnerable populations. We still have not done everything we can to protect them, including ensuring they have the highest possible rates of vaccination. But it is important to recognize for the vast majority of members of our community at this stage in the pandemic, with the vaccines being available to us, and particularly with the booster doses being available to us, is we have a very strong level of protection against severe disease. Next slide, please. And in our decision making, we certainly have to pay attention to cases of COVID-19 and its impact on the healthcare system, but we also have to take account of all the other impacts on the population. In this infographic from the Canadian Medical Association, there's listed just some of the impacts on the healthcare system. On the lower left in green, 70% increase in opioid-related deaths. And at the bottom, an increase in anxiety levels. And beyond health, we know there's so many other impacts for individuals. We go to the next slide. But even within health, the impact on mental health of individuals. Some of the stats from Statistics Canada here, all adults have seen an increased risk of being positive for symptoms of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And the group with the highest declines in mental health is youth population aged 15 to 24, the age groups primarily of our students. And that's why our Medical Officer of Health for the region, as well as public health officials at all levels, have increasingly been talking about how we have to manage our approach to the pandemic in terms of mitigating the most severe impacts of Omicron, but also ensuring we mitigate the impacts from all these other conditions as well as those on broader society. Go to the next slide. And something that, again, public health officials and educators at all levels have been talking about is the importance of education. And we've heard the importance for schools to be the last to close and the first to reopen. And we've certainly seen that that applies as well for our levels of education. As the data shows, our populations are at the lowest risk of severe impacts of COVID-19, yet they face some of the highest risks of the pandemic lockdowns. And the government has prioritized the education sector, as we've seen, for return to in-person experiences. And this is important from a mental health perspective, but also from a learning perspective and the experience that our students have. If you go to the next slide, throughout the pandemic, we've had a series of important principles to guide our planning. First and foremost, health and safety is our top priority. And this includes looking at all aspects of health and the burdens that the pandemic is placing on us. We rely on the guidance and advice of the public health authorities, particularly the guidance from our regional medical officer of health and the provincial public health officer, the chief medical officer of health, as well as our Ministry of Colleges and University. And our approach has been on continuing to develop multiple layers of protection, which we'll walk through in a minute. Also, very significant planning principle is that we have a responsibility to deliver a student-centric experience to our students. Our students have planned to be on campus in anticipation of return to in-person experiences, and we need to honor the commitments we've made to our students. We know that the impacts of remote learning are disproportionately felt by the least advantaged. You need a certain level of resources in order to have access to the technology, the bandwidth, and the spaces within your living environments in order to be able to effectively learn in person. And many of our students have a desire to return to campus to be able to access what they need. And finally, we have been committed to sharing timely and relevant communication and to engaging with all of you. And as I said in my introductory remarks, we know that we need to continue to do better. So turning to our plans to return, next slide, please. Since the beginning of this term, we have been offering essential in-person instruction, some of practicum courses in the health sciences, as well as laboratories. As of next week, our plan is to bring back in person labs, seminars, lectures, and tutorials, with some of our largest lectures continuing to remain online until after reading break. As of Monday, in alignment with the provincial reopening plan, dining and athletics have reopened at 50% capacity, and as the province continues to move through the stages, our services will come back. Also in line with the provincial requirements for non-instructional spaces, we will maintain physical distancing and other requirements in open study spaces. I know one of the questions is, doesn't reopening increase risks for the community? This is why we have to continue to maintain our precautions and to continue to do our reopening and return to campus in a gradual manner as outlined. Along with the province's plans for gradual reopening, this will minimize the potential impacts on the healthcare system. The province and the local public health authorities will obviously be monitoring the indicator, and if circumstances change, as always, we will follow their guidance. Go to the next slide. With respect to employees, there are employees who will have to return to in-person activity. They're supporting in-person student experiences as of next week. And other employees, we will be working with you, your managers will be working with you to plan your gradual return to campus. And at present, with the province signaling that March 14th is when the remaining major public health restrictions will lift, that is our goal, to have employees return to usual working arrangements. And Jim will talk about some of the approaches that will be taken around making those plans. And with respect to research, we will continue to advise as the restrictions ease on changes in research. Next section, if we go to the next slide, we'll walk through the employee survey results. First of all, I really appreciate all of you that took the time to provide feedback. This shows the number of responses by group, and this is certainly for a survey of this type is a very good response rate. Go to the next slide. We see in the terms of the item on how you're feeling, a very equal split between some of you feeling great in green and some of you feeling terrible, and about a quarter of you in the middle. And this, I think, certainly given the circumstances we're in, is certainly expected and understood. If we go to the next slide, very much appreciate the high levels of people that feel supported by their immediate supervisors, by their managers, and that within your teams, your units, 60% believe that you're doing a good job of discussing the impact of changes. Again, I certainly see that only 53% feels that senior leaders are considerate of employee well-being and safety. I hope that from the comments I've made, you can see that that is our topmost consideration as we make our decisions, but we need to do more to gain your confidence in that respect. And about 65% agreed that our communications have been helpful. And again, we will work to improve our communications and engagement with you. Next slide. In your reported responses, there's certainly a significant proportion who feel that you are accomplishing a lot more work during the pandemic. It may also be that you've got a lot more work to be done as a result of the pandemic, but there are some of you who've been able to do less work. And again, as we this will be very informative as we do our future of work planning over the next few months. And in the next slide, we can see that a very significant proportion of you are not feeling good about these return to campus plans. And certainly we're looking forward to the discussion and the dialogue and to presenting, as we've done today, our rationale for these plans. So the next slide is showing some of your hopes and concerns, and certainly many of you are looking forward to seeing friends and colleagues and for collaboration and interaction with students. But we know that there are some of you that in answer to that question said you're not looking forward to returning. And in terms of the concerns highlighted, there are concerns about COVID-19 and the safety precautions, as well as concerns around work-life balance, impact on productivity and commuting. And these are all things that as we have our discussions again around future of work, as well as campus safety, we will work to address with you. So go to the next slide. I'll just go through our plans for a safe return, and again emphasize that health and safety is our top priority. Our vaccine mandate has been very well received, and I thank all members of our community. And this is the most critical aspect of our ability to return cautiously to in-person experiences. And as I've signaled, the Chief Medical Officer of Health has said that education at all levels is essential, and has also noted that our sector across the province demonstrated the ability to deliver instructional activity in a safe manner in the fall term. And that is part of the consideration in the advice that he's given to us. If we go to the next slide, I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's now referred to as the Swiss cheese model of pandemic defense. There's no single perfect layer of defense. As I said, vaccines are a very important layer, but even vaccines are not going to be ever completely perfect. And so we have a number of layers that we've implemented. Every single one has to work together, and we can then tolerate if there is at any given time a weakness in one of the layers, the others will help protect us. So if we go to the next slide, with respect to vaccines, we have 99% of everyone coming to live and work on the campus is fully vaccinated with 2 doses, and many of you have now received booster doses. And those people that aren't vaccinated have approved accommodations for medical reasons or creed reasons. They went through a very careful review process, and those individuals do have to take extra precautions, including regular testing in order to attend to campus. And as I showed earlier, adults who are vaccinated and follow the public health advice are very strongly protected from the most serious consequences of COVID-19. Now, one of the questions that has come up is whether we make the 3rd booster dose part of our vaccine mandate. That is something that's being very closely studied. Omicron's only been with us for a few months. The booster campaign has only started a few months ago in a significant way. The data on this is still coming in, and I expect that in the coming weeks, we will get further clarity on whether this is going to be recommended. And certainly we will follow the advice that we get from public health authorities and leading researchers on whether we should implement the booster as part of our vaccine mandate. And we also need their advice on how that's going to be defined in terms of intervals and so on. Go to the next slide. With respect to masks, particularly what we now know about the modes of transmission of Omicron is this is one of the next most important layers of protection. We rely on the advice, apologies, there's some extra text in the slide, from the public health agencies on what the appropriate level of face covering should be for general and non-healthcare settings such as ours. And that is either a medical grade surgical mask or 2-layer cloth masks with highly woven fabrics and effective filter layers. We are making masks that meet these criteria available for employees, and we're going to have them available for students that would like to pick them up as well. There are situations in which members of our community, such as our healthcare facilities, need higher grades of protection, and the safety office does the assessments and makes those grades of masks available. We do recognize that some of you have asked for N95 or KN95 masks, and we are working to procure those, and on a limited basis can make them available for those that request them. But I would like to note, well, N95s are the gold standard and they provide the highest level of protection. In order to provide that level of protection, they should be fit tested and worn in an appropriate manner. And one of the key considerations around masking is ensuring usability and ensuring that people will wear their masks. And with N95s, when they're worn appropriately, they can get uncomfortable and can lead to people pulling them down or wearing them more loosely than the fit testing provides for, which actually reduces the level of protection for the individual as well as the community. And that's why we really have to look at all of the factors in combination: the filtration capacity of the mask, the fit of the mask, the comfort of the mask, and the usability of the mask when we're going to be wearing them for a long period of time. If we go to the next slide, on rapid antigen testing, there is a very significant global shortage of all types of testing, including rapid antigen tests, and Ontario and Canada has been experiencing that. At present, they are prioritized for sectors like healthcare, and the Chief Medical Officer of Health has set out criteria for where they should be used. In settings such as ours, particularly when transmission rates are higher as they were earlier in the year or late last year, they can be very valuable when they're used in a regular manner at disrupting chains of asymptomatic transmission. As rates of transmission come down, the relative value of testing programs like this will start to diminish. And there's a little bit of a paradox in there. As the rates come down, obviously we'll have more supplies of tests. But again, recognize that there are some people who will feel more comfortable if they're able to have access to this, and we will continue to work with the province and local authorities as supplies are available and through the mechanisms that the government is looking at developing for making these tests available directly to the community. We go to the next slide, and this will be my final point, is on ventilation. And I know this is an issue also of concern to members of the community. I would like to note that our team has been working from the start of the pandemic in improving our ventilation and did an incredible amount of work last year to retrofit the ventilation systems for the buildings on campus, and has installed MERV 13 filters, the highest level of filtration that can be effectively installed in systems such as ours. And they're running at maximum capacity with maximum airflow rates without concern for energy limitations. So we're using lots of energy in putting through those airflow rates. And this work was well ahead of work in other institutions and other sectors where some of this just started late in the fall or even earlier this year. We've also purchased a supply of portable HEPA filters and will make them available. And we have identified a number of classroom spaces where there are fewer than 4 air exchanges per hour. There's no single standard for this from any of the public health authorities, and the assessments have to be based on room size, the capacity, the occupancy, as well as the air exchange rates. And so we're taking a very cautious approach here, and we will do further evaluation and analysis in those classrooms. In the meantime, not use them. So at this point, I'll pass it over to Jim to talk about the changes of work.
Thanks, Vivek. I just wanted to make a few comments, as Vivek indicated, in terms of our shorter term and then longer term approaches to the changes to the way we work, and whether we're talking about the short term or the long term. Of course, it's a very complex issue, as we've had a lot of experience with over the last 2 years, during which our focus has been on adapting and getting through the twists and turns dealing with different phases of the pandemic. So as we enter a phase when we imagine the greater return to work and study on campus, we recognize the need to have as is indicated in the slide, a robust dialogue about the future of learning and what work looks like at Waterloo in the longer term that fits that model. So there are a number of complex factors that will feed into that, and will need to be sensitive to collecting all of the inputs that will help guide the best decisions during that period of time, recognizing the state that we go into doing that planning, how people are feeling, what people are recovering from, and what the plans for the way the university operates. We have to continue to focus our goal on striving to meet the needs of our students. This is a people and student focused institution. And we need to focus on creating a good university experience, both for our students and a good work experience for our employees. So there are, in summary, there are individual considerations, there are group or interactive considerations within units and across units that will inform that planning, and then there's institutional considerations as well. And that's the basis of saying that it's a robust and forward-looking plan that we need to start undertaking as we are able to return to campus and planning our future. If you go to the next slide, please, Anne. The fundamentals of getting that process underway are in place because we thought we would be able to undertake that at various phases over the past 2 years. So we have already established the workforce planning unit, which will be a center of coordinating the activity that will go into planning the future of work approach, and starting to build workforce plans with some units. And that will eventually have to be rolled out to include all faculties and ASUs. The purpose of having a coordinating unit is to make sure that the factors that need to be taken into account are systematically discussed and taken into account in that complex planning, as the needs of the individuals, groups, and units overall are taken into account, and how that fits into the institutional framework. Next slide, please, Anne. As I mentioned, some of this activity had been started to be undertaken in a pilot way that involved scenario planning, involving elements of continuous improvement and engagement, both with the groups under consideration and informed by a recent employee engagement survey, and looking at what the current work, the future work of the unit looks like as a first consideration, and then considering how that looks in terms of the workplace, both the physical and the non-physical elements of how work is done, so scheduling, space, facilities, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a recognition that in order to have that coordination and alignment that's going to be necessary both within units, between units, and eventually across campus, that there will have to be some process in place that allows for that alignment, those discussions to be had at all levels, so that of interest, that there's appropriate stakeholder and leadership review in the process, so that we know that our actions and our plans that we're putting in place locally fit into a larger institutional plan. And there are a number of individual processes, supports, and tools that are developed and ready to be deployed as part of that planning process. So those are the only comments I want to make, just as some preliminary comments on the future of work planning. But I do want to just acknowledge that through the consultations that have been undertaken at various phases of the pandemic, of how the employee engagement survey and other periods of time in which we were looking for ways to recognize the extraordinary contributions of employees throughout the pandemic. If you go to the next slide, please, we have heard repeatedly that time away from regular work and time to disengage from work that's going on in the background that others doing is one of the best ways to recognize the extraordinary efforts of employees. So we had planned before Christmas and validated through January that we would approach that by that the president will institute 2 extraordinary holiday days for the university that will be implemented on February 26th and on October 11th. So those days will both follow holiday weekends that are already in place. They'll follow Family Day and follow Thanksgiving Day, and they also both fall within reading breaks to try to minimize disruption to other operations. So there will be a communication that will come around to outline the details of this and how the contingencies will be in place for work that is necessary to happen on those days, and how employees that are engaged in that will be alternately recognized. And as we have done in certain terms throughout when transitions have affected students' access to full services, we are refunding nominal $125 to students against their bills, their fee bills, as a very small gesture, financial gesture, to recognize the hardships of the twists and turns on students and their planning. It's not meant as a some sort of indication that we think that addresses all of the struggles and issues that you've had, but because it's part of what I hope you'll experience as a supportive environment upon return, and units that are tuned in to the fact that you will have many other needs for supports through our services, etc. So there, as I said, there will be wide communication on both of those initiatives later, but this was an opportunity to widely announce that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vivek and Jim, for those opening remarks. Very important context as we continue the discussion today and enter into the Q&A session. I'm Sandra Banks, and as Vivek mentioned, I will help to moderate this section of the President's Forum. First off, thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We very much appreciate receiving these, and we've been able to capture some of the common themes across these questions, and we will start with these questions. I would also like to remind you that you can now submit questions in the Q&A section, and we will try to address as many of those as possible. Please know that there will be a comprehensive set of Q&As released online on the President's website, as well as a summary of the broadcast today available over the next 24 hours. So with that introduction, perhaps we can get underway with the first question. Even with the decline of the Omicron wave, lots of people are still worried about getting COVID while they're at work or school. Vivek, perhaps you can say more about why it's right to return to in-person experiences now rather than waiting until later in the month.
Sure. Thank you, Sandra, for the question. And so first of all, as we saw, we have a very clear decline in the incidence in the community of new cases of COVID-19, and that decline is projected to continue. And has been confirmed through a variety of different sources. We also know, as we described, and see that education has to be a priority and an essential service, and it's our responsibility to get back. I certainly appreciate the concerns that we've had, and I appreciate that from a public health perspective, we've had 2 years of messaging about the protections that people have to take, and amongst the most significant messages early on in the pandemic was stay home, stay safe. And so it is a shift that we all have to work together on. There's a big difference from the earliest days of the pandemic and today, and that is we have vaccines that we did not have. And in our community, 99% of the population that's coming to campus has been vaccinated. We also know a lot more about the virus and how it transmits, and so we're able to take the safety precautions such as masking. And so for individuals that are healthy adults that are vaccinated and take the precautions, the level of individual risk that they have is very low. And so I know that it's challenging because it's been changing messages over time, but we are in a much different place than we were from the early days of the pandemic.
Thanks very much, Vivek. We also have a question about what appears to be a contradiction in government policy or government rules on return. And the question is, why is it only safe for movie theaters and restaurants to operate at 50% capacity, but there are no limitations on the number of people who we can bring into a classroom?
Yeah. So a couple of things about that. First of all, is that the government does set different requirements for different sectors. And because they consider our instructional work to be an essential activity, the education activities, they have set different parameters and ease the capacity restrictions in our instructional spaces. We still have to follow the 50%, as do the restaurants and other settings for the non-instructional spaces like dining and athletics. And there's other sectors which also are operating at higher than 50% because they're considered to be essential. And the reasons for that are, as I outlined in the earlier parts of the talk. But the other thing to, again, say is that in the early stages of the pandemic, we focused quite a bit on physical distancing, 2-meter separation, and capacity limits in part were related to keeping people apart in spaces. The capacity limits now are more tied to reducing the number of daily contacts in the population. So as we're working on the gradual return, what the government has identified is, there's some sectors that can start to open up more fully, like ours and K-12 schools, and there's other sectors that will open up gradually, and there's some sectors, nightclubs aren't allowed to open yet. And that is being based, again, on data that we now have about where transmission events are most likely. And it's also why we see the gathering limits for households not being eased as quickly, because in this period of gradual return, we know that a lot of the transmission events actually took place in those gatherings that were happening outside of settings such as ours, where we have many restrictions in place in terms of maintaining safety.
So some sectors are prioritized ahead of others because they are essential to our community and society. We do have another question about what has been seen as a one of the protocols to deal with the pandemic, which is around tracking and tracing. And the question is, if we're not tracking and testing as we were earlier in the pandemic, say back in 2020, why should we feel safe to return now?
Yeah. So again, it will start to sound a little repetitive. Again, our situation is different from early in the pandemic. The virus has actually evolved, and in earlier versions. If you go back to the first SARS from 2003, was a virus that passed from person to person through close contact, and so contact tracing is a significant aspect of managing, particularly when you don't have other tools like vaccines available. With Omicron, with spread being airborne, it is more likely to spread, and it's more likely to spread asymptomatically. Contact tracing becomes a little bit more challenging to do, in that if someone is able to transmit in their asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic period, contact tracing doesn't stop those cases. And as well, we're vaccinated. And so this is why public health authorities towards the end of the year started to shift the strategy away from testing and tracing, which was the hallmark in the early days, and to really emphasizing again things like the vaccination and the masking, staying home if you're symptomatic. And so we will continue to rely on the advice of the public health authorities. And at this time, they have said we're not a setting in which there is a priority for doing the kind of case management, contact tracing that was being seen in the earlier parts of the pandemic. But the safety for individuals, again, comes from being vaccinated, doing the symptom screening before you come to campus, wearing your masks, and following all the other precautions.
Okay, thanks, Vivek. Jim, I think the next question might be for you. It comes from a student perspective. Can students be given the option of returning to in-person or stay online?
Thanks, Sandra. Can you, am I on? Okay, great.
Yeah.
I didn't have, oh, the red box is on now. Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks for the question. We've really undertaken since the beginning of the pandemic to make it clear what our ultimate goal is, which is to return to more in-person experiences as soon as the public health conditions allow. And the reasons for that have been emphasized by Vivek and in the response to other questions. It's because there's really no substitute for what happens in the classroom and in the lab, where there can be learning that's interactive, hands-on, enriched through contact with professors, instructors, peers, and direct interactions, and all of the other activities and supports that the campus environment provides for students while they're learning. And we decidedly believe that that time is finally here when we can undertake that, and that's why we made the commitment to do it. We made the decision at the beginning of this term to start most classes online in light of the situation, in order to promote the safety as the province learned more about the Omicron variant and then came out with further guidance. We've been clear, I think, over that time period that this is a temporary measure, and that students should be prepared to come back to our campuses for learning by early February. And so we're implementing that plan. That's what's happening on the 7th of February. We're confident that the vast majority of our students are keen and ready to return, but we're also very aware that there are some that are still concerned. And those students can reach out to understand what their options are to their academic advisors. As Vivek mentioned in his remarks earlier, we'll continue to monitor conditions, of course, but a shift to online learning has always been part of our continuity of education plan in the event of an emergency. But such a move, or such a request-based move to online is not part of our plans as we endeavor to get back to doing our planned in-person learning in the manner that we planned for.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Good to know students can check in with their academic advisors if they have specific questions. And I'm sure we'll have one or two more questions from a student perspective, so don't go too far away. But for now, we're getting a lot of commentary about filtration and air quality. And the question is, we know some universities have been able to announce their air exchange rates for specific classrooms. Will Waterloo be sharing more information about ventilation rates in its classrooms online?
Sure. Maybe I'll just say a couple of words and then invite either Dennis or Dennis Manka to speak further on this. And I just want to emphasize what I said in my presentation, that certainly from the time of arrived at the University of Waterloo, I've been very impressed with the work that the plant ops team has done on the upgrades to the HVAC systems in our building and the overall approach to hygiene throughout the pandemic. And I would certainly see Waterloo as a leader in the work that's been done. I also know, again, from the questions and questions such as this, that we need to do more to share what we have done and be transparent about it. And so, you know, I'll pass it maybe to Dennis to say a little bit more about what we will be doing and posting.
Vivek, since Stepanka led the work, could we let her respond? Please?
Sure, please, Stepanka.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So with respect to publishing the ventilation rates, at the moment there is no ventilation rate that is published by any of the government organization, whether it is Public Health or ASHRAE. So that was the reason why we have not published one. But since this issue of classroom safety has become really concerning, we have made the decision of shifting and moving all of the classrooms that have ventilation rates below 4 offline and rescheduling the classrooms. We will be purchasing, well, we have purchased about 300 HEPA filter units that we are waiting for. There will be a handful of them that will be arriving early next week. So the classrooms that have ventilation rates just below 4, they will get some additional ventilation available to them, and so we can help the registrar's office and the different faculties of helping people to feel safer.
Thanks very much, Stepanka. Good to see you today. Thanks for joining us. We are going to go back to a question about PPE. Even though we presented some information in the PowerPoint, a question about N95 respirators being the gold standard, and why isn't the university making these mandatory and sharing them with employees and students? There is a related question to that I might add, a concern about handling such physical items as exam papers and worried about the risk of surface transmission. So 2 questions in that, Vivek, perhaps. The gold standard N95 masks and surface transmission through, say, papers.
Okay, so again, as I said, we rely on the advice from the public health agencies, and for settings such as ours from both Public Health Agency Canada and Public Health Ontario, the advice is to not use not to have to go to the level of an N95, but rather 2 layers of tightly woven fabric with a filtration layer. And a mask such as that is worn appropriately, tightly, and is comfortable is more likely to be acceptable and be usable throughout the day. And so the N95s, as I said, do require fit testing and can be more uncomfortable. KN95s are a little bit in between. They don't require the fit testing. And so, but again, then the difference between the 2-layer with filter masks or a surgical mask, the KN95 starts to become smaller. Also go back to the Swiss cheese chart. We can try to aim for perfection in every single layer, and certainly that will provide a greater degree of protection, but the marginal benefit gets smaller and smaller when you're adding on to so many layers of protection. And I will make another point, because I know environmental sustainability is a big concern for many members of our community. And we will, as a society, have to have discussions around what the appropriate levels on each of these things. As we mentioned on the airflow, we're doing it right now without attention to the energy consumption. But ultimately, that's going to have an impact if we want to meet our energy reduction targets. Using disposable masks on a frequent basis has a bigger environmental impact than using reusable masks or cloth masks with just the filter layer being reused. And so these are not going to be easy conversations, obviously, but these are all considerations that have to go into our minds. With respect to surface transmission, I think that's another case of, at the time that we had a new unknown virus 2 years ago, and we didn't understand its mode of transmission, we did pay a lot of attention to surface, potential for surface transmission, quarantining books, and so on. We know that that is not a major source of this particular disease spreading, but it is something that we should continue to pay attention to, and that's why basic precautions like hand hygiene remain important, right? And washing your hands, if you do handle materials such as that, washing your hands after you've done it, before being careful about moving your hands to your face and so on. But I would again say that we don't need to have the same degree of concern about transmission from objects or surfaces as we had when we had an unknown virus.
Okay, thank you. Now, maybe I should just let people know who are, we do have we're very appreciative of the large attendee group that we have. We are prepared to go for the next 10, 12, even 15 minutes if you're able to stay online, and we will answer, I would say, probably 3 or 4 more questions, given the time where we're at.
And Sandra, I do want to also add that in addition to the personal side of on that last question around surface transmission, hand hygiene, there is all the things that Plant Ops continues to do with its enhanced hygiene activities to ensure our campus is as safe as possible.
Thank you. We are getting some questions today about decision making around these aspects of returning to campus, and what are the considerations and the engagement with students, faculty, and staff in terms of consultation on these decisions.
Maybe I'll ask Jim to take that. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Sandra, and to the questioner. There's been a long period of enhanced consultation and communication that's accompanied the whole COVID period, and of course, I think the concern over these related issues becomes most acute at times when decisions have to be made fairly quickly in rapidly changing circumstances. So I just wanted to provide the perspective over the course of many months versus the perspective of the acute perspective that might be motivating the question. But this involves many elements, like the regular communications about our plans when possible, long in advance of when the plans are actually executed, has been part of our strategy in terms of widespread communication and opportunities for feedback from the broad community. And we've used our updates from leaders in various fora, either at places like Senate or at groups of leaders, where leaders are conveying what they're hearing within their units, both ways, up to central administrative offices and messages down into units and faculties. We've used all of those regular meetings to exchange information about what people are hearing and how, so that those views are being distilled up into helping to inform decision making. Probably some of that isn't as obvious to members of the community, but I think there's a great amount of sensitivity to and compassion for views that are expressed by people that do feed that information in. So, I mean, in addition to those channels, those councils, and the communication strategy that I referred to, there have been events like this forum. The president has participated in podcasts, for instance, And the employee survey that recently was conducted was another mechanism to collect that. And as you can see, it has been given thoughtful consideration in terms of educating us to better explain the situation and driving our future communications and decisions. So I'd maybe leave my own personal reflections there. I don't know if Vivek wishes to supplement the answer or not.
Okay, that's great. Well, why don't we move on to another subject relating to the return to campus for our employees. And some would note, in addition to our students coming back at the same time, and if you could talk a bit about what is the approach between February 7th and March 14th? What appears to be in some people's minds a rush to bring that many people back. And then secondly, well, let's start there to not overcomplicate it. Maybe we can just talk about the February 7th and the March 14th timeframes for employees.
Yeah, okay, maybe I'll make a few comments on employees, and maybe I'll put it in the student context as well, just because we've talked about the importance of student-facing folks, so I can give a sense of the progressive approach there, and I might call on Marilyn to add any further comments if I miss something important. But there has been some attention to reducing the density of people on campus, both in terms of the student population and in the employee population that's gone into this plan to make the return as gradual as we can, with the goal of returning to in-person learning. Employees who don't interact with students directly have worked their unit plans to reduce employee density during the early phases of the return to the normal work arrangements, and that's what the February 7th to 14th period is in terms of a gradual return. Those most necessary on the 7th. We know that'll look different in different units, so people are going to be experiencing this differently and perceiving it differently. But at an institutional level, that's what the approach has been, and individuals, of course, can expect to hear from their unit heads on specific plans for their return to in-person work. As always, we do support a flexible and responsive approach over this transitional period, taking into account the work of the unit and the circumstances of the individual, in the context of our goal remaining being to bring people back to our campuses over that broad period. On the student side, I think it's important to remember that both from the instructors and student-facing, other student-facing employees who are working with students, that the gradual return began on the 4th of January, because we did commence essential in-person on that time scale, and there are about 5,000 course enrollments that were in that category already active and have been active over the whole course of January. And so both the students that are in those course enrollments and the instructors and other support personnel have been facilitating that return. On the 7th, on February 7th, that'll increase to about 60% of course enrollment students in terms of a density. This isn't courses. This is of the total course enrollments for the winter. About 60% of them will be activated on the 7th of February, and that will bring many course elements back, as Vivek pointed out earlier, and people that are involved in delivering those and supporting that higher density of students. You know that there is a list of courses that have been identified by the faculties to be put on hold for return to online, identified, published by each of the faculties and consolidated on the COVID information site, which has every faculty's courses identified and is a resource for people to go to. Those are scheduled to come back then at the 28th of February currently. And the other thing to not lose sight of is that every term, pre-pandemic, even Waterloo has a significant fraction of course enrollments that are already planned online because they're online courses that have been pre-planned and scheduled, and so that's about 20% of the teaching activity this term, regardless of changes in modality that have been driven by the decisions we made about delivery. So I just want to give a little bit more perspective on the gradualness and not the suddenness of everything returning at once, both on the employee and the student side. I'm not sure if Marilyn wishes to add anything else. I'm sure I overlooked something important.
The only thing that I would add is related to in your opening comments about what the workplace might look like in the future. We do have a workforce planning unit, and so we've been working with each faculty and each academic support unit to find the right plan for that unit and that faculty. It's dependent on the work that happens in that area, the work of the individual. We know that some individuals have said that they've been able to work really well remotely. Others, not so much. They indicated in the survey that they haven't been able to do their work effectively. So there will be those that will come back earlier than others, and the plans for each faculty, for each academic support unit, will be dependent on what is best for that unit. So it won't all look the same, and it's all dependent on the approval of the executive council member that's responsible for that particular area.
Thanks, Marilyn and Jim. I will point out to Jim and Vivek and our audience that we're really looking at 3 more questions, an employee and dealing with some employee concerns and some student questions. I'm wondering though if we can answer quickly a question that's come up fairly frequently about the policy around work from home, and if there's any update to share on that, especially given what our employees told us in the survey that we just reviewed.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. I'm glad that that's come up, because we did notice and make note of the information from the employee survey that flagged that. It's really that information was very helpful as our teams across the university are working in coordination and with HR to look at the needs of their units and how we can plan for the future. So it was a good prompt and input on that. I think, as has been shared in the slides and with Marilyn's comments, we do have many projects underway to facilitate that work with units, to plan for a range of scenarios and build on the improvements over time that we've already made and look at new work demands to help us guide the future of those units. But having seen what some employees have noted as their enjoyed flexibility and productivity that the expanded from homework arrangements have allowed in the last 2 years, that has brought a new lens to a new incentive to accelerate the discussion of the current work from home policy. It remains as an item that we're looking at very closely. We'll have an update in part prompted by the feedback from the survey as soon as possible on our work from home approach, including the scope and the conditions and the approvals that would be part of an updated policy to help guide in the shorter term than I think otherwise might have been expected.
Thank you. We'll look forward to hearing more on that.
Thank you.
I would note that that if Stepanka was back with us, she'd probably want us to reinforce that even though surface transmission is not the main mode or a concerning mode of transmission, there is ongoing enhanced cleaning protocols across the campus, which have been underway and will continue absolutely as we bring more people back. So thanks very much for reminding us of that, Stepanka. The next question is really about absenteeism that may occur in the coming weeks. How are we going to accommodate students who cannot attend class due to symptoms or need to isolate for another reason? Do we have any insights or suggestions around that question?
Yeah, I can take that, or at least start. So for sure, when students are ill, they're encouraged to not attend class and to self-declare their illness in the Quest system that students have access to. So they can find the illness self-declaration form in the personal information section of Quest, and doing so does not require a doctor's note for accommodation under these circumstances. So for most instructors and course administrators in most courses, their plans for accommodation due to students self-isolating will be similar to the accommodations that would be provided to students that have to miss some classes due to illness or family emergencies or other legitimate reasons that come up in the normal course of time as well. So Waterloo's instructors and student support staff have routinely shown compassion and caring for their students in many ways, including in providing means to students to succeed in their courses when these events that are beyond the student's control happen to them. So we expect that will be the normal course of processing such requests. We encourage, of course, everyone to remain compassionate and sensitive to everyone's needs during the period of the transition, but that's been demonstrated over and over again. So thank you.
Yeah, good reminder for all of us. So this will be the last question, and then I will invite Vivek to give some closing remarks. And I should just point out that we have kept a very thorough tracking of all the questions that have come up. Some are more complex than others. There's many themes that we've been able to get to, but we will be responsive in providing information and as much detail as we can in the coming days around the questions that we've not been able to get to. So this is the final question. February 7th is coming up. We have first-year students and in some cases even second-year students who have yet to be on campus. What will their experience look like? How are we preparing to welcome them, to help them get comfortable and knowledgeable on campus?
I can start on that one too, if you'd like. Yeah, we're very aware of this and have been thinking about it throughout the pandemic, because we've been through 2 cycles of knowing that there are students starting that haven't been able to have a full on-campus orientation. Part of that is what drove changes to and refinements to the Welcome to Waterloo programming that accompanied the beginning of new terms when new students are starting, in the development of a number of digital and online resources to help with the orientation. But we've always recognized that that's not the same as actually getting to know and navigate the university campus, its services, and many other things. So I just wanted to make the point that this has been top of mind, but I'll turn it over to Chris Reed to maybe highlight some of the specific approaches that will be in place in this particular circumstance.
Really happy to see, Sandra, that this is this question made it in before we had to sign off. It's somewhat exciting to look forward to some of the things that we might be able to do to support students as they return to campus over the next month. That there will definitely be elements of the feel that we have when a new fall term starts and there are new students coming to campus. So starting next week, people will see things some enhanced wayfinding on campus, things like that. New some of the programs that Jim talked about will be available starting next week for new students as well. We are super sensitive, of course, to the fact that it's the middle of the term, but we want to orient people where we can. And so over the course of the next month, we'll see around campus here to help Ask Me booths in prominent locations. Next week around Ring Road at a few key traffic areas, there will be booths that will be staff to make sure people know where they're going and those kinds of things. So we're really looking forward to having a little bit of that new student transition feel back and returning to campus starting next week, and then probably continuing over the course of the next month or so.
That's terrific, Chris. Thanks so much. And we know there's dozens, if not hundreds, of our employees that are engaged in welcoming those students back. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for being part of this. I know now we're going to turn back to Vivek, who will offer some closing comments.
Great. Thank you, Sandra, first of all, for moderating this, and Jim and all of our colleagues. And a big thank you to all our attendees. I saw us max out at close to 1,500 people, and I believe there's over 500 questions that have come in. So really appreciate the engagement that we've had. I also can see that there continue to be many concerns and a wide range of issues that people are worried about. And as you noted, we will be working to try to answer as many questions as we can and to post them up in the coming days. And we're committed to continuing future engagement and being transparent in all of the information that we have. I just want to close by again noting that a lot of the concerns around safety, personal safety, safety for one's family, and again, just emphasize we know so much more about this virus now than we did 2 years ago. We have vaccines, we have treatments, we have ways to control its spread. And there's things that we do as an institution, that our governments do, and there are things that we can each do individually. And the most important, now it gets repetitive, is ensuring that we're vaccinated, that we've received our booster when we're eligible, that we encourage our friends and families to be vaccinated, and we get those vaccination rates as high as possible in our community. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. That brings us to an end of this President's Forum. We will be following up, as we noted, on the President's website and on the COVID website with a full Q&A and publishing releasing the recording of this broadcast. So great to have so many of you involved, and we'll see you again soon.